I would say that the average American knows a handful of founding fathers pretty well. I mean, how could we not? George Washington has over 90 places named after him, including a state and the nation's capital. Same goes for other founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Adams. Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, despite not going on to become presidents, had their own form of recognition and reverence, being on the $10 and $100 bills. But the list goes on. Although we've hit a lot of the top tier major players to the inception and creation of the United States, this list is far from complete. The people that helped create the United States, people like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Jay, to name a few, all had their part to play in the creation of an entirely new country. Many of these founding fathers still have recognizable names, even if they don't readily come to mind. But there's one particular founding father that was critical to the revolution in the years that followed. But he doesn't have a recognizable name. He doesn't have the musicals about him, or the monuments made in his honor, or even a place in many textbooks. And it's not necessarily that he was lost throughout the course of time, as even some highly regarded, influential people throughout history sometimes fade from memory, but rather, this founding father seems to have been intentionally distanced from the rest, forgotten almost by design. When he passed away in 1806, they held no speeches for him, no monuments dedicated, simply a 5-line obituary in the local papers. Yet to say that he played anything other than a large part in the independence of the nation he hoped to see built would be a major understatement. The financier of the Revolutionary War, Robert Morris Jr., used his immense wealth and business acumen to transform the outlook of the war, getting the new nation through some of the toughest financial troubles it ever faced. But his actions after the war would land him in hot water, going under scrutiny as the very first congressional inquiry, and later, being put in prison for his actions, leaving him to die poor and forgotten to history. Welcome to the Biographical Babbler. The American Revolutionary War and the subsequent founding of the nation seemed to flip the world upside down. A couple of colonies banding together to take on the world's most powerful military, and setting up what would one day become the most powerful country in its own right. It was something that few of the time foresaw. It was a time in history that saw many rise to the occasion and do something that had never been done before. During these tumultuous times, many would climb far higher up the societal ladder than they ever might have had they lived in a stable time, but others were better off than you might think. John Hancock had been adopted by his wealthy uncle, able to attend Harvard College. Benjamin Franklin, as an entrepreneur and inventor, was extremely well off in the decades leading up to the Revolution. But none of the founding fathers, or for that matter anybody in America, held a candle to Robert Morris Jr., the wealthiest man in America at the time of the Revolution. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Robert Morris Jr. wasn't even born in one of the American colonies. He was born in Liverpool, England in 1734, though little is known about his early life. However, some things have been pieced together. His father, an agent for a shipping firm, likely had Morris out of wedlock with Elizabeth Murfett, and it was likely because of this that he was raised by his maternal grandmother in England until he was 13 years old. At this point, it was clear that his father wanted him to follow in his footsteps as a successful tobacco merchant. Seeing opportunity in the New World, Morris's father brought his son to America in 1738, setting up a shipping company in Oxford, Maryland with his father's friend Charles Greenway. While he was successful in this venture, it wouldn't be long before tragedy struck the family. In a wild twist of fate, and one of the most bizarre historical deaths I've come across, Morris's father was aboard one of his merchant ships having a dinner party in the year 1750. Near the end of the event, as a few of the crew and Morris Sr. climbed into a small boat to go ashore, the captain of the ship readied his cannons to fire a salute, as was customary at the time. However, a fly landed on the captain's nose as they were readying the cannons. So he swat at it, which the crew thought he was doing to say, "Hurry up and fire the cannons," and they followed the order, shooting the cannons prematurely at Morris's boat just 20 yards away. Morris Sr. was struck by debris, breaking his arm and inflicting a wound that became infected almost immediately. He would die just 6 days later, leaving a fairly large fortune to his son, Robert Morris Jr. Now, Morris Jr. had only been in school for 1 year before he moved on to an apprenticeship as a clerk in Philadelphia, working under his father's friend, Charles Willing. He still wanted to follow in his late father's footsteps, though. Despite his young age, Morris had a deep understanding of the shipping industry, having been inundated with it for years, evaluating risk that pirates pose to ships, as well as shifting market demands, with knowledge of the complicated monetary system, able to quote prices in British pounds, French livre, Dutch florins, and other major currencies off the top of his head. He demonstrated his worth to Charles Willing almost immediately. As he entered into adulthood, Morris was brought in as a full partner into the company, and it was renamed to the Willing, Morris and Company, which was quickly becoming one of the largest and most successful companies in all of the colonies. But this wasn't enough. Biggest in the colonies? How about biggest in the world? At least, that's what Morris thought he could achieve, becoming one of the first colonial insurers of cargo vessels, even opening up a few routes from China and the countries around the Mediterranean to American trade. But everything would change in 1765 when a wrench was thrown into his plans that came in the form of the Stamp Act of 1765. You see, the British had been at war for the past, 7 years or so, fighting the French in the aptly named 7 Years' War. Gosh, sometimes the names just come easy. Anyway, this war was expensive, and even though the British would come out of it victorious, they were hurting for money, and the costs would only grow. In one of the most golden handcuff situations possible, the British would take over all the French land in North America, greatly expanding their territories. But they decided to keep an established 10,000 British soldiers in North America, which they stated would help keep the peace between the colonists and the Native Americans. Though in reality, if they were to disband the 10,000 troops after the war ended, it would mean putting nearly 1,500 officers out of work, and many of these military leaders had strong connections to members of parliament, and keeping your military leadership happy was always a priority, especially for a country that used them as often as Britain. Though to keep them in North America would mean costs of around £225,000 per year. Because of the costs incurred, the British Parliament figured it was time to start taxing the colonies. Britain already had laws on the books taxing the colonies before this through duties on imports and exports, but they had been slacking on actually collecting these taxes pretty much since the start of the 1700s, so the colonies weren't too upset about them. But then came the Sugar Act of 1765, which placed more duties in place on sugar and other goods, with a promise that they would actually start enforcing the duties that were in place. This was going to hurt the pocketbooks of the merchants and subsequently the colonists in the British territories. But they likely would have made do if this was the extent of the British taxes. Some traders of the time already had started setting up smuggling routes to get around the 3 pence per gallon tax on foreign molasses imported. Tensions would go from simmering to a violent boil 1 year later, however, with the passage of the, you guessed it, Stamp Act of 1765. This pushed the colonies over the edge because it wasn't just another duty on trading, but a direct tax on colonists, getting its name because it required all legal documents and printed materials to have a stamp that you would pay a tax to obtain. If you were creating a will for your family, it needed to have a stamp. A new deed for your house? Gotta have a stamp. That sucks, but how often are you getting a new deed or writing a will? Well, no joke, the law also required stamps for newspapers and magazines, not to mention pamphlets and even decks of cards. Magicians weren't the only ones fuming at this law. It was by far the biggest reach from the crown that they had seen, and pushed the people into a forceful resistance. These protests actually argued that it was within the Parliament's rights to regulate trade. But without any representation, not being able to vote for members of Parliament, they had no right to instate a direct tax. This was made worse as the act said that those who violated the act would be denied a trial by jury. In other words,
right to jail.
Which brings us back to Robert Morris Jr., who took issue with not only the Stamp Act, but also the increase in duties that would directly impact his business. He had been trying to expand into trade with India, the West Indies, Spain, and Italy, but the tax would wipe out the necessary money to do so. Morris was on the front lines of protests in Philadelphia, banding together with several other merchants to quite literally run a British tax collector out of the city, and even convincing a tea ship to turn around before it could dock at the port of Philadelphia. But despite this, and the fact that Morris was nominated as a delegate from Pennsylvania to the Second Continental Congress with his fierce opposition to the Stamp Act, he initially decided to oppose the notion of declaring independence from Britain. Instead, being the typical businessman he was more of a proponent of negotiating more favorable terms with Parliament, fearing how going to war with the world's most powerful military power would impact his business and status. But when the Continental Congress put the issue to a vote, Morris knew he was in the minority, abstaining from the vote, allowing a unanimous vote in favor of independence, because he knew that if he abstained and it was a unanimous vote, it would be easier for people to throw their support behind the movement. And, to his credit, once the vote passed, he threw the entirety of his reputation and resources into the war effort. After he signed the Declaration of Independence on August 2, 1776, Morris would say that it was the duty of every individual to act his part in whatever station his country may call him to in hours of difficulty, danger, and distress. I don't believe that simply signing the Declaration of Independence is what earned Morris the title of Founding Father, but rather it's the fact that even though he initially wanted to avoid war, once the vote had been decided, he did everything within his power to ensure victory for the new nation, and it truly revealed where his allegiances lay. It's not like he didn't have a choice. He could have been a loyalist like approximately 15 to 20% of the population, but instead, he took a chance on America. But as one of the richest men in the American colonies, Morris knew better than anyone that America didn't just need to succeed militarily to win, they needed to succeed financially. And in its infancy, America had deep struggles with funding its war effort. The 1777 Articles of Confederation, the United States' first constitution, allowed Congress to request funds from the states, but it didn't require the states to comply. Hey Georgia, can I have $15 to fight this war you were in support of? No.
I don't know what I expected.
With taxes being a very touchy subject at the time, the Articles of Confederation were quite different from the modern constitution used today, and didn't allow the federal government to tax its citizens. Because of this, troops went for months without pay, while Congress begged the states and European allies for loans. But it wasn't enough. On the brink of economic ruin, Congress appointed Morris as the Superintendent of Finance, the government's very first executive office, showing just how dire the need for money was. It's said that when Congress unanimously elected Morris to one of the most powerful roles in the country, those in attendance stood and applauded, but would become shocked to see that Morris remained seated, staring ahead without acknowledgement of appointment. As one of the oldest founding fathers, Morris was worried about the toll this role might take on him, but eventually, he accepted. Unlike the later office, the Secretary of Treasury, that would be held by Alexander Hamilton, Morris was given nearly unchecked powers over America's finances, though you could argue that given the circumstances, a temporary expansion of power was necessary. Given that global trade was very risky in a time where you would have to wait weeks or even months before you could determine if your trade mission was successful, you often relied heavily on personal relationships and reputation to assure that the process ran as smoothly as possible and everyone was paid their due. Morris leveraged these business contacts in the shipping world and relationships with foreign investors to procure desperately needed supplies and munitions. And he would go a step further, borrowing millions of dollars backed by his own promissory notes. That is to say, if the government didn't pay off the debts he was accruing, the entities loaning them money and supplies would take Morris's personal assets. He also worked closely with another revolutionary financier and Polish immigrant, Chaim Solomon, to fund the Patriot cause for much of the war, both putting their own money on the line. As a Marine Committee member for the Continental Congress, Morris worked closely with the country's Navy, with a biographer, Charles Rappleye, writing that Morris was the de facto commander of the Continental Navy, putting forth a strategy to isolate and pick off British ships rather than taking on larger groups head on. But, like many of the other founding fathers, Morris made himself useful where he could. When Washington needed gunpowder, Morris used his merchant ships to smuggle it past the British blockades. When the newly minted Continental Navy needed ships, Morris supplied 3 of his own. When all other American currencies collapsed, Congress paid troops and bought supplies using Morris notes, essentially IOUs guaranteed by Morris's immense wealth. After the first currency of the United States, Continentals, had essentially failed, Morris notes became the only reliable currency within the nation. While it's a little overblown to say that Morris single-handedly financed the revolution, his credit and reputation allowed Congress to sustain the war effort to a degree that would have been impossible without his support, including staving off the bankruptcy of Congress on 3 separate occasions. But here's a question to ask yourself. How much of this was truly self-sacrificing? That would be a question that would haunt Morris in the years to come. When he was contemplating whether or not he should accept his appointment of the Superintendent of Finance, Benjamin Franklin had written a letter of warning to him, saying that the business you have undertaken is of so complex a nature and must engross so much of your time and attention as necessary to hurt your private interests, while you are sure of being censored by malevolent critics, who will abuse you while you are serving them. But what Ben Franklin might not have expected was that it might help Morris's private interests rather than hurt them. Because even while helping out the war effort domestically, putting his fortune and assets like ships on the line to bolster America against the British, Morris still profited immensely from his international trade. And that's where he began to run into some trouble with Congress. After the Constitution was ratified and Morris was elected a senator from Pennsylvania, some of his fellow congressmen openly asked whether Morris had truly funded the revolution or whether he had profited from it. In 1785, Congress had passed a resolution calling for an investigation into Morris's financial dealings during the Revolution, but that threat seemed hollow, and the investigation was never initiated. When the matter was brought up again in 1790, Morris wrote a letter to George Washington requesting that the investigation actually be carried out this time, if only to clear his name. In the end, Congress settled for a report of Morris's business receipts from the period in question, but none could find any evidence of him misusing his position for profit. In fact, some instances he pressured merchant collectives to lower prices to get a better deal for the nation, not for himself. Though there were some points of interest, including that Morris had only accepted the role of Superintendent of Finance on the condition that he could continue his private businesses on the side, claiming that he was bound in honor and by contracts. He also gave his own company numerous contracts while serving as the chairman of the Secret Committee for Trade. This by itself, however, was not enough to justify conviction, and Morris was exonerated. His time in Congress was at an end, and he would finally be able to refocus himself back on his businesses and a life of wealth and leisure. It seemed like things were starting to finally look up. After the investigation ended and his term in Congress concluded, Morris left politics behind, devoting his full time and energy back into his businesses. Despite everything that had happened, he had faith that America would be a strong country where people could make more money than they could ever imagine. Wanting to take part in this, he began to take at least a small interest in nearly every industry, building a factory town along the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, which to this day bears his name. In everything from silkworms to maple sugar, Morris saw his business prosper. In terms of shipping, he formed partnerships with several other businessmen, where he would often provide financing for ventures, but left the details up for others to decide. In fact, he was so optimistic about America that he felt they were going to see an incredible surge of immigrants like never before. And how might one profit off this influx of new Americans? Well, you buy up all the land before they get here and sell it to them for a massive profit when they arrive. In the year 1791, Morris was clearly the richest man in the nation, but he was sure that the land was going to be the biggest frontier for wealth creation in the future. He started off this whole process with a deal in western New York, selling it the very next year for a nice profit. This led him to believe that his suspicions were correct. He doubled down, purchasing hundreds, then thousands, then millions of acres across Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas. These purchases were cheap by today's standards, sometimes costing less than 12 cents per acre, but the vast quantity began to eat up a significant portion of his wealth, as well as millions of dollars of loans to purchase a total of 6 million acres of land. That's 7 times the size of Rhode Island. Confident that he could flip it in a year or two for a massive profit. He was so confident, in fact, that he started construction on a massive mansion in Pennsylvania, so large that it would take up an entire city block, designed by the engineer that made the layout of Washington, D.C. But the problem was, the large population of immigrants didn't come, and wouldn't for another century. By 1796, his partners began to drop out, and his creditors began to ask where their money was, seeking around $12 million, an unheard of amount of money for the time, even for someone who was one of the richest in the country. It was money he didn't have. And the land he did have, he couldn't sell, as much as he tried, because the Napoleonic Wars in Europe were wrecking land values in America, as Europeans either sheltered in place or were sent off to battle. He had overextended himself, and now he was trapped financially, losing assets left and right as creditors seized them for failing to pay on his loans. His unfinished mansion in Philadelphia was never completed, though it garnered the name Morris's Folly. To avoid those wishing to collect the money he owed, Morris ended up locking himself in a countryside house for months. But eventually, he relented and was placed in a debtor's prison, where people who couldn't afford to pay back their loans stayed until they could repay what they owed. He served 3.5 years behind bars, only being released after Congress passed the Bankruptcy Act of 1800, allowing him to liquidate his assets, including his Morris's Folly, which was scrapped for its marble. Even after this liquidation, it was found he still had debts of nearly $3 million, though this was wiped away with his bankruptcy proceedings. Robert Morris left prison a changed man, living his last 5 years away from the world of business and politics, scraping just enough to get by. And those around him were disgusted by his actions after the Revolution. When Alexander Hamilton died, he was given a military send-off, saluted by officers with a eulogy from fellow founding father Gouverneur Morris. When Benjamin Franklin died, his coffin was carried to its resting place by some of the most important figures of Pennsylvania, with a eulogy from Thomas Jefferson. When Robert Morris Jr. died penniless on May 8, 1806, the local papers only printed a 5-line obituary. There were no speeches for the former founding father, and no monuments erected in his honor, like so many others that he worked closely with. He played an extremely critical role in the founding of the United States, but despite becoming one of the richest men of his time, has very nearly become forgotten to history. Though in 1865, he was painted onto the ceiling of the United States Capitol Rotunda, alongside George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, in a painting titled The Apotheosis of Washington. Thank you for watching the very first episode ever of The Biographical Babbler. I am so happy to finally be doing this. It's a channel that I've wanted to start literally for years, and have only just now gotten to the point of pulling the trigger and making the videos. Just a little information about the channel. I would love to cover various historical figures as the name implies, but I also want to cover different historical places and events. Feel free to leave suggestions for me to look into, and I would also love to hear your feedback on the video. With this being my very first video, I'm really new to the whole content creation space, so if you have anything that you think I could focus on to improve the quality of the videos moving forward, I'm all ears. And if you want to help this channel spread to more people, as I know newer channels on YouTube don't really get as much traction very quickly, feel free to like or comment below, or even share the video with someone you think will like it. I hear that stuff really helps the videos. But anyway, thank you for watching. Be safe, have fun, and I'll see you in the next one. Good talk.